You are listening to the Wildlife Photography Podcast with Rob Reed and Josh Galicki, bringing together the love of nature and photography. Episode 10. We discuss the essence of photography and capturing different forms of light. Well, hello everybody, and welcome to the Wildlife Photography Podcast with me, Rob Reed, and my co-host Josh Galicki. Hi Josh, how's it going?
Hey Rob, doing well, doing well. Looking forward to this discussion actually, and
Yeah, it should be a lot
happy
of
that it's
fun.
spring. Yep.
Yeah, it should be a lot of fun because well, being spring, there's a lot more light around than there was in the last few months. That's for sure. So I thought it would be a great topic for us to talk about. So anything from sort of natural light and all the way to artificial forms of light like flash and LED. But we'll get into that, a little bit later as we get into the podcast. But what have you been up to recently?
Things are starting to move in. I mean, spring migration is in full steam right now. So I've been getting out when I can, early mornings. We have a lot of songbirds coming back in the Northeast United States. Ducks have pretty much moved out. Herons, waders are coming back. So it's exciting. My first Forster's terns, they came back about a week ago. So I'm seeing a lot of things move up the coast now. So it's exciting and more to come. I mean, the dams are really going to burst in the next 2 weeks. We're going to have,
Yeah.
a lot more of the, later migrants arrive, and it'll go all the way for probably the next three to 4 weeks for most of May. And then at the end of May, we have a lot of shorebirds coming back, the famous red knots, dowitchers, they'll all be heading up to the Arctic, and I'm going to get to the beach as much as possible. So looking forward to it.
Yeah, busy time of year, isn't it? I mean, because here
Yeah.
we've got, well, as I said, I think I mentioned last time we spoke that we've got warblers coming back into the woodland, but, I've had swallows and house martins now. I know that friends of mine have seen hobby, for example, coming in. So, yeah, it's all happening. And of course, I walk through the wood and it's so nice at this time of the year. Just you go in there early morning and the dawn chorus is just
Yeah.
fabulous. It does really, really sort of, it's
Lush
very, very,
green.
very uplifting, isn't it?
Yeah.
It's so good.
There's
But
nothing better, to your point. I think walking in kind of a misty, wet spring wood and hearing the dawn chorus,
yeah.
it's hard to top that in nature. It really is.
Well, we were chatting yesterday because we did the judging for light, our light category, which really was the inspiration for doing this podcast. Actually, was that particular subject, and I was telling you that we had such a cold spring. I mean, it's been wet and really, really cold for like the last couple of months, and it was only really yesterday when I happened to have to sit inside and talk to you guys and judge light that it was really warm and sunny, and it felt like spring had finally arrived.
We
But
finally just got some rain here. It's been pretty dry, unusually dry.
yeah,
Normally, March and April are very wet months, but it's been unusually dry. Now the rain's starting to pick up, which is a good thing. But
yeah. Well, we're back to the cold and the drizzle today. Unfortunately, I think it's going to be better tomorrow. But yeah, then the next few months, I just really enjoy this time of the year when you can get up at 5 in the morning and it's starting to get light and it doesn't get dark until 9.
yeah,
I mean, it's partly why Jennifer and I disappeared to the coast in December, because you just can't take, at least the quality of light at the coast is better.
yeah. The
And
flat horizons, no doubt, help
yeah,
out. Yeah.
exactly. So it kind of brings us on to light, I guess, doesn't it? And
Yeah.
I thought, why don't we start the conversation about that, and let's talk about the use of natural light. And I guess the traditional way when people first start out in photography is that they're always taught that have the sun behind your back, and you so the subject is front lit, and that's the way it should be done. And I guess there's a lot to be said for that, and I still sort of shoot subjects like that.
Hmm.
But again, you're talking about the quality of the light and the light temperature and the time of day. That makes a big difference. But most of my photography now, I have to say, is done shooting into the light with side lighting, because I just find it much more exciting.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm with you on that. And I'll say from my standpoint, there's no one form of light that's better than the other. You can create great images in any form of light, frankly, right? But I think each type of light that you use certainly has its advantages and disadvantages, and requires sometimes more from the photographer and sometimes less from the photographer. And I think you have to be more creative, especially as you were just saying with direct sun. That's where most people start. That's where I started when I started photographing birds. You want the sun behind you, you want your shadow in front of you, the wind behind you, so the birds will fly directly into the wind toward you. So there is a few things that you would check off in the field, and you'd get ready to take that shot. And it's a great place for people to start. But it's still a great place to come up with photos, even if you've been shooting for many, many years. You just have to make it interesting to the viewer. So I'm with you. I think I like side light, personally, as I've kind of shot over the years. It's the most dramatic to me. Again, if you use it correctly, or you apply it correctly in the field. And I like backlight as well. But each kind of comes with their own advantages and disadvantages. Even diffuse light, just on a cloudy day, there's advantages there. And we can kind of get into those and talk
Yeah,
more
and I
about.
think the thing to remember is that the very definition of photography is the capture of light.
Yeah.
And I think I often sort of use this in some of the talks that I give, that if you think about photography as capturing light rather than capturing the subject that's in front of you, it changes your whole mindset towards towards photography. I just think it just gives you a different perspective on things if you start thinking in that way, which is why I I like playing around, with light coming from different sources and different directions, and seeing the way it plays on things. And as you're saying, that there are no real lighting conditions that you can't use for photography. You just need to adapt what you're shooting, I think.
Yeah.
So if you take an overcast day, for example, and let's say you've got high cloud, that's perfect for doing for doing sort of high key
Yeah. You can add
images.
an artistic element into it. Absolutely. I
Exactly.
agree.
There's always things you can use, even on dull overcast days, even if it's raining. Take, for example, at the moment, so many spring flowers coming out, in the woodland. I mean, this is why I love this time of the year, because there's so much to have a go at. If it's raining, as it was this morning here, and it's overcast, just think how you can use those conditions to photograph, rain-soaked plants, for example. That nice, diffuse, even lighting that you can. I mean, the the possibilities are endless with light.
I agree, and it creates a nice setting in those conditions. I was just shooting the other day songbirds in the morning, wet, diffuse light. And there's something about when you have a light rain when you're in the forest canopy. I don't know what it is, but it creates these pastel colors. You get these pinks and purples in the background, and it's very, very pleasing. And then, of course, you have water in the frame. It adds a sense of feeling. So yeah, absolutely. Something that you can't get in using other forms of light. It just, you have to know how to take advantage of the situation. And that
Well,
comes with experience.
yeah, speak to a lot of people photographers that photograph woodland, for example, and their favorite conditions are when it's drizzling, where you've got that light rain, as you were just saying, or you've got this fog,
Oh, yeah.
because it
Fog.
creates the separation.
Yep.
Because woodland is very chaotic by its very nature. And I think, when you introduce those elements, well, one, especially if you've got a sort of polarizing filter on as well, the saturation of the colors in those circumstances can be just look awesome.
Yeah. The
It
greens
just
get
creates
richer.
this yeah, it just creates this different feel. So I think, I always look at the conditions, and if I've got time, which I haven't had a lot of just recently, but if I've got time to get out with the camera, if it's doing something like that, then I'll go into the woodland. If it's drizzling and it's overcast, and I'll go, right, okay, well, I can use those conditions to my advantage. Yeah, a lot of those woodland guys, they love those conditions, and I've seen some awesome stuff, from people that use those conditions in a very, very creative way. They're so clever. And the other thing I like about those conditions as well is when you do get that little break in the cloud, and you get these shafts of sunlight coming through that drizzle or that fog, it can just be
Yeah.
so
Amazing.
dramatic.
Amazing. You
So
mentioned a polarizer. I've got a warming polarizer that I've been using for years in similar conditions, but it warms things up just a little too much. When I put it in post, like for the greens, I like more blues in my greens than yellows. So I'll cool it down, and But yeah, amazing conditions to shoot in, especially when it comes to cloudy diffuse light. You want that extra element. I think it's a lot tougher if you're shooting on a cloudy day and you don't have those conditions, or you're not within the canopy. There's more on the photographer, because I've seen situations where, and for me, I photographed a particular mammal or bird under just kind of, I'll call it, boring cloudy conditions versus dramatic light conditions. In order to, if you're in that boring cloudy kind of diffuse light, you have to make it interesting, and that's where you have to step up your game, because the light isn't going to be the central portion of that shot. Maybe there's subtlety in there, maybe there's an interaction, or maybe there's a feeding sequence, or a predator prey sequence. It's more on the photographer at that point to up the game of the photo, not letting the light do that. So there has to be an introduction, I think, a subtlety or interaction, something to make the image interesting beyond just kind of the diffuse light on a cloudy day. So again, depending on the situation, more may be asked of the photographer in the field than other situations.
Yeah, because I guess when we're talking about artistic images, we're talking about an element of drama, aren't we? Something that sort of pulls that viewer in.
Yeah.
And if you haven't got those dramatic lighting conditions, which we can go on and we can talk about some of the situations that we've had, then you need something else. I'm with you. And in fact, I was, earlier today, I was looking through a shoot which I had in very, very similar conditions to that which you were just describing last year on one of my local lakes. And I was photographing ducks and coots and that sort of thing. And I was using reflections because, reflections and also slower shutter speeds to get a bit of motion in the feathers where they're sort of shaking themselves off, or they're preening, or they're just to try and do something a little different and try and get that drama into that image, to get that story into the image in some other way, because the light was very, very flat. So I was using this sort of mirror reflections and a little bit of motion, that sort of thing, to try and do something a bit different. I have to say, my favorite images are with that dramatic light.
Yeah.
I don't think you can beat that. And in fact, I quickly moved on to another one of my favorite folders and picked out another image which I shot a couple of years ago in lighting conditions, which I don't think I'll ever get again. Not in that way. And I had to process an image which I'm quite pleased with, actually. But
you make a good point. You mentioned flat. I mean, that's when it comes to contrast can make or break images. And when you're shooting on a cloudy day, diffuse light, your images are going to be more flat. You don't have that contrast just based on the type of light that you have. So when you shoot in more dramatic conditions, that's when you can really take advantage of contrast, whether it's silhouettes and shapes and extreme backlight, or side light for, emphasizing certain parts of the animal or your scene. I think, it just depends on the situation.
Yeah. So you mentioned side lighting earlier. What is it about side lighting that sort of really does it for you?
Well, I like extreme side light. I don't, well, maybe that's the wrong term, but strong side light, not necessarily soft, because when you have a side light that comes in, or light that comes in from a particular angle in the frame, it creates shadows, and it also enlightens certain areas. So there's a sense of mood. There's an emphasis on shape. There's an emphasis on, there's some mystery in the photo. And even if you go back to, famous painters, and there's always an introduction of shadow and an angled light that comes in. It can offer a low key look where, especially if you have a lighter subject where you're exposing for the whites, you can get this dramatic low key effect, or you could get a certain emphasis on things. Macro photography, using even artificial light. Whenever I have a softbox, if I'm photographing a frog, snake, or whatever, I always bring my light in on an angle overhead. You don't want to have just direct light. It introduces a sense of interest and mystery there. Whereas everything evenly lit, it's rather boring, especially from an artistic standpoint. So I think it's very, very interesting, and it's tough to use that light, because when the light is coming in at a certain angle, you want to make sure that you yourself as the photographer are at the right angle and at the right distance, where you have the light falling where you want it to. Because if it doesn't fall in the right spot within the frame, then it's not going to be a good shot. So
yeah, because you're using light to emphasize the bits of the frame that you want the viewer to concentrate on, aren't you? That's the whole point of it.
And eliminate distractions as well. It naturally eliminates distractions. If you're shooting in diffuse cloudy conditions and everything is illuminated and it's rather flat, you have to be sure that you're framing up with less distraction, or you're going to have to do something in post processing that I don't like to waste a lot of time on doing, whether it's blurring or any of that. To me, that's a little too much,
And
but
it kind of, you can kind of tell as well when that's, when people have done that,
yeah.
it doesn't really look natural. And that's really what you want to get to. Do you know that when we sort of, when you were talking about the sort of side lighting and, the contrast that you're looking for, it reminded me of portrait photographers and studying, that particular genre, which I think is really, it's really important for people to step out of the sort of wildlife photography arena and look at other areas of photography and draw ideas and inspiration from them. And when you're looking at portrait photography, if you want a corporate headshot, for example, so you want nice smiley, but you want even lighting, and the standard lighting setup for that is flash either side of the camera, pretty much evenly balanced, put the subject in front of you, here we go, bang. I mean, I've done it loads of times for people. But if you want a more moody image, let's say you're looking for, let's say it's it's a musician, for example, and you want an element of drama, you want an album cover, or you want something, you're not going to shoot an image like that. You're going to use a single light, a dark background, emphasize certain features on the face, that sort of thing. And when you draw inspiration from looking at that type of photography, I think you can use that in wildlife photography, to your
Absolutely.
advantage, and take inspiration from those sorts of things. I think it was Gail was saying, wasn't she? I think when we spoke to her that, or I know, having spoken to her before, Gail Bisson, who's been on the podcast, she takes a lot of inspiration from other forms of photography. I mean, I look at a lot of street photography, for example, because I like
Mm.
the way they also use light in this way, the side lighting, the back lighting, those sorts of things to add drama and emphasize sort of shape, form, because
Yeah.
that's what they're drawing the viewer's attention to.
And in nature, when you're shooting wild subjects, whether it's, mammals, birds, and what have you, for the most part, I think you can make some exceptions with macro, because you are controlling things a bit when it comes to light direction and source. But you're not in the studio. You don't have that luxury of, bringing in someone, sitting him in a chair and working on all these natural angles. You have to wait for that type of light, and the best light that you get out in the field in order to get those effects, it's a dramatic side light, whether it's dappled light coming in, or whether it's, coming in from a specific angle where you really have to wait for those conditions, and you have to take advantage of them. You can't just walk into the field on any day and recreate that. So
No. And I think when you start breaking free of having the light behind you, and there is absolutely nothing wrong with that style of photography if that's what does it for you. But when you break free of that and you start, as you're saying, playing around with side light, playing around with backlight, things really start opening up for you. You really start to see, uh, the benefits of, and the possibilities, and the different effects that you can get by overexposing, by underexposing, by using little specular highlights that are out of focus in the background, bokeh,
yeah,
and the beautiful effect that can give you. And you can create that in so many ways. It
yeah,
could be sun shining through dew droplets, for example. It could be gaps in the tree canopy, so you've got the brighter sky behind, little gaps in the tree canopy, which when they go out of focus produce nice bokeh, all those sorts of
mhm,
things. And of course, when we come to talk about artificial lights, and we've seen a lot of this, in wild art recently,
yeah.
particularly for the light category,
Top
is
100
those
amazing artificial light images. Yeah,
yeah,
probably my favorites.
is
Look,
those sort of city lights reflecting with a
yeah,
lot of the water birds that we've had, and the effect that can, well, water birds and things like urban foxes and all those sorts of things. I mean, it's just so dramatic
yeah,
when you start experimenting with this thing, and when you really start understanding how you can use light to sculpt your subject and draw this attention,
hmm,
or add in that extra element of absolute magic to an image.
yeah.
I mean, one of my favorite things is backlit mist at dawn.
Oh, yeah, yeah,
I mean, man, there are so many things you can do with that. If you, this is a great example actually for photographing something with the sun behind you and how you can change it dramatically by doing the complete polar opposite of that and photographing into the sun. So if you imagine that you have a misty morning and you've got the sun coming up and it's coming up behind you, and then it's lighting that mist, you're going to get a pretty white image, pretty high key image, because there's, all you've got is the sun reflecting directly from those water droplets. Whereas if you shoot from it into the sun, you've got that lovely warm, color temperature of that, that sort of golden hour period. It's coloring the mist and it's creating this drama. You can see all the little wafts where it's, where the density of that mist is different, and it creates these little clouds, and you can start putting things into silhouette. You can start introducing a little bit of extra bokeh if you've got that water in if you're talking about water birds or something similar. There are so many things you can do with it. And you're going from a pretty sort of, I guess, almost high key image with the sun behind you, to creating something with a lot more depth and color and mood. So if you think about the differences, just given that particular example, then I think you start to see how just changing the angle of the light source completely changes the dynamic of the image and the story that you can tell with that image. I think that's very, very powerful.
Yeah, I totally agree, Rob. And I'm thinking about it at a high level. We were just talking about sidelight, and sidelight to me is, it's based more around the principles of portrait photography. You can add character, you can add charisma, you can add personality, you add emotion and expression in an animal's portrait, or a photograph, or using sidelight. When you're using backlight, for me as a photographer, it's a completely different emphasis. It's not an emphasis on the animal's expression or personality. For me, using backlight, it's an emphasis more on shape and color. You're emphasizing, the rich colors that you get from, the sun rising in the background, your yellows, your reds. When it comes to shape, it could be the silhouette shape based on the exposure. It could be the shape of the bokeh. So you're just using different elements, and you're emphasizing different elements in the frame. So I think going from sidelight to backlight, you're in a completely different situation, one that's much more different, I think, and one that can go from personality based to an animal to one that's more artistic when it comes to color and shape. So that's kind of how I've always viewed those different lighting situations in the field.
Yeah, because I mean, the sort of that silhouette style or that rim lighting style with a backlighting, I mean, that can just be so powerful. I mean,
yeah,
take a look at the top 100 in the light category that we've just judged, and that will, go to the Wild Art website, and there's a link right on the homepage. Or if you're listening to this a little bit later on, and we've moved on through the categories, that there'll still be the gallery there. Just drop down and have a look at the winners tab at the top, and you'll be able to navigate to the top 100 for light, because there's some really inspirational stuff there. Some people that have really used light in a very, very clever way, and a great examples of what Josh and I have just been discussing, actually, that from side lighting through to backlighting, because those sorts of things. I mean, you think about things like breath, escaping breath, and that sort of thing that can really add that drama to an image, and you can't get that without an element of side lighting or backlighting.
Yeah, absolutely. And one thing I do when it comes to backlighting, I think you have to choose your subjects well. If you're backlighting an image, even when it's, you have an early morning light, the light is very subtle. It's coming up, and you get nice rim light around the animal. And the light is a bit more evened out, where you could see the front of the animal when you process the image. It's not silhouette. As the light gets a bit harsher, it becomes more the dynamic range. It becomes more of a silhouette. But that said, what's consistent in all these situations with backlight, I look to find subjects that have conspicuous shapes that are identifiable by the audience, whether it's the rim light of the subject, or in more harsher conditions, whether you have the silhouette of the subject. If you have a subject that has a distinct shape, I think it comes off much more powerfully, where your audience isn't guessing what that is, whether it's a bear. Or recently on Instagram, Rob, I posted it was a silhouette image backlit of a swan. I mean, you can't, it's undeniable when you look at that. It's a swan, right? Based on the shape of the neck and the bill and so forth. So I always try to look for subjects that are conspicuous when it comes to shape or have interesting shape to
No,
show.
I absolutely agree. Actually, the silhouette images that work the best are the ones where you look at it instantly and go, I know what that is.
Yeah.
So you're not guessing. That part of it's already, imprinted itself on your brain. And now you're looking at the rest of the image because you know instantly what it is. You're not sat there going, well, I don't know what it is. What is it?
Yeah.
Because then you're not looking at the photograph as a whole. You're trying to work out, what you're actually looking at. Whereas if you had that instant recognition, I think I agree with you. It's much, much more powerful. And when you've got those, when you've got those animals like a swan, like an elephant, these iconic things that you cannot mistake for anything else,
Yeah.
it is, it's a lot more powerful than, I don't know, some form of invertebrate that you don't instantly connect with.
Mhm. Or maybe
You know,
even the posturing. If you're shooting a
yeah.
bear backlit, you want the bear standing up or maybe breathing with breath versus, laying down on the ground and being a blob. So
Yeah, so yeah, you want some separation from the
yeah.
various sort of body parts, don't you?
Yeah.
One of the better expressionists. That's not the most elegant way of putting it.
And one thing too, I think that's difficult when it comes to backlight images. I find it. We spoke in one of the previous episodes on digital manipulation or post processing. If I take an image that's backlit, especially early morning sun or late evening sun, there's not a lot of contrast in that raw image. Your raw image is generally flat anyhow, but you'll basically have kind of a reddish or orange glow. Your subject will be there, and it takes much more attention on the post processing side to bring out the contrast and process it correctly. Whether as opposed to if you're shooting something with direct sunlight, it takes a lot less processing. Your contrast is there, your colors are more accurate.
It's a bit more obvious, isn't it,
It
as
is.
well, I think, when you look at it, because it's a bit more literal,
Yeah.
and we're going back to the sort of conversations we've had in the past about, literal images versus artistic images. And I guess this is really where this conversation is going again to a degree.
Yeah.
We're talking about the use of light. And if you're shooting with something, as you were saying, with the sun behind you, and you've got the raw images capturing those obvious elements, it's much easier to process because you're just tweaking levels, really, aren't you, with
Mhm.
something like that? It doesn't take a lot. Whereas, yeah, you're absolutely right. When you're
Camera
when you're
sees more what you're doing. You see
yeah,
as the camera with direct light versus backlight, you see better than the camera, and you have to really do some. It's fairly substantial sometimes.
yeah, and it's easy to get it wrong as well. And
Yeah.
we've both seen that when somebody's taken what you think, oh, that's a really good idea, that's a really good image, but the post processing leaves a little to be desired, and they either haven't calibrated their screen, or they, they're not sort of processing it in their brain the way that perhaps in a way that gets the most out of the
Yeah.
picture. Because I think what frustrates me sometimes is when people take an image and they process it in a way that, yes, they're trying to extract all the artistic juice out of it, if you like, but they make errors and they create something that's not of this planet. So therefore, the connection starts to get lost for
Yeah.
the viewer, I think, if you try to overjuice things, which is a phrase I know you like to
Yeah.
use quite a lot,
Yeah.
or they get
Nu
something
the
wrong.
the nuclear
Yeah,
plus 100 on the color side. I agree. I think there's 2 fails. It's the color, overjuicing the color on backlit, and also the black point. I think finding a good black point in the image, whereas if the contrast is done correctly, there's not much of a black point. There's more of a gray point, or just things are they're just washed out, and it doesn't necessarily have a good, it's not leveled out accordingly. I think black point and color are the 2 things that stick out most for me when I process something that's backlit,
yeah.
especially an early morning or a late evening backlit that's not strong enough where I have a silhouette where I'm not silhouetting my subject.
What's your view on sort of taking images where you've got burnt out highlights, or you've got, you know, uh, areas of shadow with absolutely no detail at all? I mean, I think you can use those very, very well artistically. And I think if you are bold with those and break those rules, which, the technical rules which said, oh, you can't burn out any of the highlights and you've always got to have detail in the shadows, I quite often break those rules. I don't know what your view on that is.
Yeah, it when in speaking about backlit images, I think, some of the bokeh, if they're a little burnt out, I don't mind. But you don't want the again, it's all choosing. It's a trade-off. You don't want parts of the frame that are burnt out or blown out from a highlight perspective that's going to distract you from the entire frame. If I'm shooting high key and cloudy conditions, all of my whites are blown out. I'm totally fine with that. If I'm shooting, direct sunlight on a wood duck, for instance, it's got this small white line around its face that can be burnt out. It just, so it just depends. I don't mind certain shadows to be very dark with no information in them. It can be done well. You just have to know how to apply it the right way and
I
not
guess it's all
distract
down to
you or
context, isn't it?
agreed.
In,
I
in, in
totally
terms
agree.
of the image. Well, I think the point I'm trying to make is that I don't think people should be afraid
Yeah.
of an image which, okay, so it might show those blinkies when you look at it on the back of your camera. I don't think you should be afraid of that. At times I want that.
hmm And you
At
can always
times I
turn
want
them
that.
back in post, even if you feel it's too much. And bringing out a few blinkies might be essential for a tougher exposure to bring out your midtones. If you want your midtones a little brighter, there's always a trade-off. Something always suffers on
Yeah,
the in the
exactly.
exposure range. Yeah,
But so I think the point I'm trying to make is that don't be afraid to experiment, and
absolutely.
don't try and get that sort of perfect histogram on the back of the camera every time. Because actually, if you're photographing from an artistic point of view, which really is, the whole point of the discussion, I guess, with light and the whole direction that you and I tend to go with our own photography, anyway, is that's not what you want most of the time. You want
Yeah,
something which is either left or is either to the left or to the right to
yeah.
to a degree, because you're bringing the emphasis to a certain part of the frame by doing that, I think.
And we were just talking about different forms of light. For instance, we were talking about side light. If I have strong side light on a great egret or a heron, a white bird, I'm going to expose properly for the whites. And because I'm going to have such a fast shutter speed to expose for the whites, everything's going to be rendered dark around it for that effect. Whereas if I'm shooting a mid-tone bird on a cloudy day on a dead branch and I want high key, I'm going to blow the whites out maybe by 3 stops. So it all depends on the situation. You're absolutely right, Rob. Don't
Yeah.
Folks should not feel constrained by the histogram.
And isn't it amazing how much you have to under or overexpose at times?
Yeah.
If you're, because everybody does it differently, and I use a lot of exposure. I use the exposure compensation button a lot, and that's just the way I tend to work rather than doing everything manually, because my brain's a bit simple and I can't cope with too many things at once. So I tend to that's what I tend to do. I tend to play around with exposure compensation, uh, and choose my the aperture and the shutter speed that I want, and let auto ISO sort everything else out. That's generally my preferred method. Don't do it all the time. I mean, obviously
Mm,
every situation is different, but
yeah.
with the way that ISO is now, you really don't have to worry too much about it.
That's a good
Um,
point. Yeah, especially with cameras today. I mean, it used to be when I had my 7D, I would never go above ISO 800. That's
well,
where I start, I think.
exactly. I was talking to a camera club recently and showing them some images, and I show my settings when I show the images so people know, how I've set my camera up to achieve what I've got. And of course, my starting point with ISO normally is about 1,000. I'll start there
Mm,
and I'll work around it depending on the situation. If I can get away with less, I mean, everybody wants to use 100 if they can.
yeah.
But the reality of wildlife photography, and we're going a bit off piste here, but hey, that's not unusual. The reality of wildlife photography is you don't have, you don't have the luxury of that most of the time. So I don't tend to worry about it, because modern cameras these days, they handle that, they handle those ISOs, particularly if you're working with a decent amount of light, so well. But I had this question: is like, why are you using that? Why using an ISO that high? And I said, because why wouldn't I? Because it
Mhm.
allows me to use the settings that I want in other areas. It allows me to use a higher shutter speed. And I'm not afraid of
Yeah.
1,000 ISO. I'm not afraid of 3,200 ISO. I'm not afraid of more in decent light conditions. Okay, if you've got a really dull, dark day and you're using 12,800 or whatever, yeah, expect you're going to lose some detail and you're going to get a bit of noise,
Yeah.
and
And
it
I
could
would
ruin
much
an image.
rather a focused wildlife shot that has the animal in focus and that's sharp with a little bit of grain versus something that's smooth as butter and is a big blur. So,
Exactly. And
yeah.
as we've said before, there is always, modern software technology to help you out with your noisy images. I'm not going to plug any particular software.
I have to say there's a new one and that's on there's a raw converter and it is dynamite. I've seen some of the conversions. I couldn't believe it. It's well beyond what I've seen in some of the previous. By the way,
Wow.
just as I noticed, Adobe Camera Raw and Lightroom, they have a denoise function now, similar to what Topaz has, and I played around with it. It's actually not that bad for what it's worth, but I digress.
Well, I saw that on the latest iteration of Lightroom, and I thought, oh, it can't be as good as Topaz, but I
Not
ought to
bad.
play around with it. Do you know that's another really good subject for a podcast, funnily enough,
Mm,
is the way, modern software. We ought to put that down on the list. Before we came on air, Josh and I were talking about a list of subjects that we want to talk about in future podcasts. And I've got about 15 or 16 all lined up because I've had a few suggestions from people that have listened and have messaged either one of us. And yeah, I think that would be another good one to add to the list. So, and that's a good thing that's a good point, actually. If anybody listening to this has a subject that they want Josh and I to cover, then do send us a message. Put a comment in the comments section below, or so, probably the best thing to do is send us a direct message on Instagram. The links to our accounts will be in the show notes. And just get in touch with us that way, and just make a suggestion. So we're always up for talking about things that people want to hear about,
yeah.
because you know keep them coming up with the ideas sometimes.
Yeah.
Isn't the
No.
easiest thing. But anyway, sorry, that's another digression from the subject. But anyway, so I guess that's the way we're sort of touching on using natural light. I mean, there's so many other things that we could talk about, with natural light, and I guess time of day. Well, let's talk about time of day actually before we
Yeah.
move on to artificial light, because that does make a difference. And we were talking about dawn, and obviously the other end of the day being evening, and the way that the color temperature is obviously so much warmer at
Mm,
those times of the day, and how you can use those to your advantage to add that element of drama, that element of storytelling into images, which is what I look for, and I know you're the same. Then you have that period of light before the dawn, which they call the blue hour, which gives you a completely different feel, because obviously the color temperature before the sun has come up or after it is set is a lot cooler. How do you tend to sort of approach that, Josh?
yeah, that's a good point. And you could really shoot at all times of the day. I mean, I've been on night drives in Africa. We shot at night with a spotlight. So there's that even before or after or before the blue hour. You know, I think it all depends on the quality of light. I prefer to shoot when there's a blue hour before um, the sun does come up, meaning a clear day or something where the sun, you it
Yeah, I
just
guess it's not going to
looks
work on
better.
an overcast day, is it? It's
On an
yeah.
overcast day, it probably doesn't work as good. And you need to be ready. We were just talking about using higher ISOs and having faster shutter speeds, accepting grain in the image. That all comes with the territory for blue light or the blue hour, which I wish they would come up with a different name because it's never an hour. It's always a much shorter time frame.
Yeah, it's sort of about 10 minutes.
Yeah, the
Because
blue
you've got
minutes,
to
I think.
balance having sufficient light
Yeah.
with that sun not having peaked above the horizon when the temperature changes.
Absolutely. And I like that. It's a great time for cool tones as well. I guess blue gives it off, but I like some of the cool tones you can get in I'll call it the blue minutes. And then, of course, when the sun comes up, if it's a clear day, you want to take advantage of that golden light. The best light is right when the sun just comes over and you get some reds and yellows. And one thing I'll say, which is a misnomer too, a lot of people, and again, it's more traditional, folks will shoot maybe in the blue hour, the blue minutes, whatever you want to call them, but they're focused on that golden light. And after, the morning and the light gets, harsher, they pack up and leave and they come back in the evening, perhaps. And maybe there's some stuff for civil twilight after the sun sets. You get some great color. I get a lot of great color. Actually, I get the best color when the sun sets on the Chesapeake Bay in my backyard. I wait for that actually for some of my favorite shooting. But you can always shoot throughout the day, even on a clear day. I mean, it's going to be harsh. you're going to have, overhead sun, but that's great for black and white images, right? Like,
Well, we touched on that, didn't we, in the last episode with African wildlife, and
yeah,
you know, and the problems with photographing that the majority of the time you've got to do it during the middle of the day because that's the only time you can actually get out, and photograph these things.
that's right. And you and I are lucky. We're, a good distance from the equator. And I've learned this when I was in South America and in Africa. When you're near the equator, you do not golden light, really. It's similar to what we were just talking about with the blue hour. It's only a few minutes. I mean, it's very, very fleeting because the sun comes up so quick based on where you are. The golden light where we're at actually lasts a lot longer and it's more beneficial to us. But I think if you're shooting on a clear day, you can shoot all day. I mean, I've gone from shooting, birds or mammals early in the morning to when the light gets harsh, I'll go get my macro lens out, can use a diffuser, go into shaded areas for frogs or whatever is active throughout the day. Or, you can shoot black and white, a lot of contrast, a lot of shadows. You can come up with some things that are creative. And then, of course, the light gets more pleasing near the end of the day. You could shoot all day. It's just a matter of how you take advantage of it and how you position.
You said something really interesting there, actually, and during those sort of harsh light periods, and that was sort of going off and finding different subjects to photograph in different areas. So you might go into an area of shade, for example, where so that you've got strong sunlight, but as you're in an area of shade, you've got this diffuse light, and then you can use it. So it is sort of thinking about how you can use these different situations and different times of day to your advantage by shooting different things. So yeah, using that that shade or diffusing the light with a light diffuser, which
For
actually
smaller
I
subjects.
hadn't got down on my list to talk about, but actually that's quite an interesting subject in itself. So when we're talking about diffusers, we're normally talking about some sort of white sheet, or if you've got a reflector of some description, quite often they'll come with the reflection bit will be a cover, and the inside of it will be like this sort of translucent sort of white material, which you can actually create some nice shade. It's almost like that high cloud that you get that when we were talking about the high key images, where you get plenty of light, but it's all diffused through this high cloud. It creates that sort of effect. So you can use those sort of things to photograph the smaller subjects. So if you're looking at invertebrates or, small amphibians and reptiles, that sort of thing, you can use those. So you've got this nice, decent, strong lighting, but you can diffuse it through those things and create more even lighting, so you can start with perhaps a more traditional literal shot and then work with it from there and see what you can get.
Yep.
But it's almost like having the sun behind you, on a high cloud day, that sort of thing. So yeah, think about that.
And some animals are more active at different times of day. So, from my experience, I can go out in the early morning, shoot birds, but I could photograph snakes, frogs later on in the day. As it gets warmer, snakes come out, so you're not going to shoot them at 7 a.m. For me, after 10 a.m., 11 a.m., and there's harsher light, you can, again, use a diffuser, reflector, shoot them with flash. You just have to be creative and know your subjects and when to approach them. And you could shoot all day, even on a clear day.
And actually, I photographed plants in woodland where they might have a strong shaft of light lighting them directly, but behind them there's an area of shade. So you can use that contrast to your advantage and underexpose. So all you get is just the sort of the brightly lit areas of the plant are exposed correctly, if you like, but of course the background is all black. So you can then start picking out just these little elements and just creating. So don't give up, I think, on these sort of harsh lighting conditions, because there are things that you can do. And the more you get into it, the more you realize, the potential of these things, and actually the more interesting it becomes.
Yeah, we were talking about side light before, but dappled forest light is special. You can get some incredible shots using dappled light within the forest canopy for flowers or even birds or even just, plants, ferns, all kinds of stuff.
And as I touched on earlier as well, it's great. You can get great bokeh if you sort of shoot upwards into the tree canopy and you got that out of focus with a macro lens or a long lens, or you can create some great bokeh with that.
Sunbursts are cool too, in situations like that. Shooting up and getting different types of.
Well, there was a shot, wasn't there? Kurum's shot in the top 100.
Yes,
What was it, iguana or
iguana
something?
from the
Yeah,
Galapagos. Yeah,
yeah. Which had if you've not seen it, go and have a look at. I said, go and have a look at the list. I know I keep plugging it, but go and have a look at the list and see that shot, because it is the sun coming from behind the iguana, just this little point of light, and he's got this starburst coming through. It's quite impressive, actually. And
yeah.
that's obviously fairly strong sunlight, I would say.
Hmm. Yeah, what's interesting about the top 100, I had a look at it this morning. All the different types of light we're talking about, you look at the top 100 and they encompass that, whether it's side light, backlight, artificial light, city lights, all these things we're talking about. You can kind of see that variety, and there's so many incredible images in that selection. I mean, yeah, it's pretty mind-blowing.
So let's start talking about adding in some artificial light now, shall we? Because we've kind of talked about natural light and the way we like to use it, to dramatic effect most of the time. To add stories to our images or add drama to our images. But sometimes, and I know you use Flash quite a lot, so let's start with Flash, shall we? And I know this is a subject that I know when I first started, Flash was a bit intimidating. I didn't quite understand it, and it took me a long time to get my head around it. But the way I eventually kind of pieced that jigsaw puzzle together was to look at it on the basis of, right, let me start without the flash and let me compose a scene and use the available light the ambient light that I've got. Then how can I use flash as an additional element to add something extra to that? So it might be, so let's take fill-in flash, for example. That's, I kind of guess, where most people will start. So I'm going to start with the example of a bird in a woodland area. So it's in an area of shade. So it's pretty flat. The lighting's a bit flat. You're not bringing out the colors of that bird that you want to see. And I know in America you're blessed with much more colorful birds than we are in the UK. Lucky things. But anyway, so you want to bring out those colors and you want to show the viewer what you're seeing and what that bird has. To add in a little bit of fill-in flash. So if you are exposing for the ambient light and then you add in an extra pop of flash just to sort of just pick that image up a little bit, just to add that little extra in. That's how I started with artificial light and learning how to use it to my advantage. Is that the sort of process that you went through?
Same thing for me, Rob. And it was photographing songbirds in woodland, right? Normally what I'll do, I like to use fill flash as opposed to flash as a main light, again, for really two things. One, color pop on these birds, and I'll take a Blackburnian warbler over a reed warbler any day. So I'm not, to your point. But
what are you trying to say? We've got a lot of little brown jobs in the UK.
A lot of brown jobs in the UK.
A lot of brown jobs.
Yeah, I would definitely do it for pop of color and then also catch light in the eye. On a flat, cloudy day when you're in a woodland or a forested area, you're not getting any catch light. So, and it's interesting how you apply it too, and it's how you balance the exposure between ambient and artificial light, even when you're using fill flash. So sometimes what I'll do is, if I'm photographing songbirds, I'll go down a stop. I'll expose the ambient light, probably, yeah, I'll go down about a stop. I'll underexpose a stop. And that means the fill light has to compensate a bit more. So through the high-speed sync, it'll push a bit more light to it, and it adds just a little bit more, I think, to the bird. And there's more darks, there's more blacks, there's more shadows in it as a result.
You're introducing that contrast again that we were talking about.
Yes.
Yeah.
So I kind of like to play around with, maybe -1 stop or maybe 2/3, and I'll play around and see what looks the best. A lot of it has to do with too, if you're photographing in a woodland or in a forested area, what do you have behind the branches? If you're photographing a bird on a branch, what's behind there? Are you going to be able to get shadow behind it, or is there more evenly lit, kind of more sky? It just depends on how you're shooting and where you're shooting. But I like to underexpose just a little bit and make that fill flash compensate a little more. If you go overboard with it too much, it gets more artificial looking, and it has that flashed look that nobody likes.
I mean, what I would say to people is that if you, like I did, feel a bit intimidated about flash, is to start experimenting with it and start to try and understand it better. And perhaps the best way to do that is not to pick a subject that's going to move around and fly away. Start with a plant, for example, and then photograph it without any flash and use ambient light, and then add in a little bit of perhaps direct flash from the camera. So you said you're adding in that bit of fill, then start moving. Play around with this, with the power of the flash itself, and see how the more powerful you make the flash, the more it takes away from that ambient light, and the kind of the flatter it will feel. I mean, think about those old images you used to take of family parties, for example, where you had to, the flash directly on the camera, and then if you used the flash to photograph people, it was, the effect was pretty horrible. It was pretty flat. But start playing around with the power of the flash itself. Play around, as you were saying, with a little bit of exposure compensation on the ambient light, and see how that makes a difference. Then start moving the flash away from the camera a little bit and seeing how that then makes a difference. And I think those, as I said, the jigsaw puzzle will start to come together, because the most effective use of flash in my way of thinking is that it adds something to the ambient light rather than the flash is illuminating the subject itself, unless we're talking about photographing at night, which is a completely different subject. That's the way I tend to look at flash. It has to add into the ambient light. That's the way I like to use it. And I might eventually start putting it behind the subject to create, as we were talking about, my love of backlight, you came through and we're talking about natural light. But if you light something from behind with a flash, and I do this in portraits as well. When I'm photographing people, for example, I'll often put a light behind the person, and actually it then separates the sort of hairline sometimes from the background. So if you're photographing a plant, you would then start picking up all the little hairs on the petals and the leaves and things like that, and it separates it from the background. So have a play around with that, because it can really be quite effective. When you start doing those things.
You bring up a great point too. I was just thinking about this, Rob, is the direction of artificial light. So that's huge. You have on-camera flash or you have off-camera flash. For fill light, high-speed sync situations, or if I'm photographing a bird or a mammal or what have you, and the flash is on top of my camera, or I have a flash bracket, but generally speaking, it's on the same axis of the lens. Fill flash works great there. If you're using flash as a main light, meaning you're lighting your entire composition up with artificial light, you do not want. It's a big no-no, unless you're shooting like a 1982 Polaroid on somebody and you're blinding them. It's a big no-no to have.
For those of our listeners that remember that,
I do remember holidays and getting whacked with that and going, "Oh my god." But if you're using flash as a main light, you do not want your flash on the same axis as your camera and your lens. You want it at an angle. You want it overhead. You want it maybe from behind, and that's where you could start controlling the situations. For birds or mammals or fast-moving subjects, if I need a little bit of fill and I'm exposing for the ambient light, it's on a flash bracket above me. But if I'm shooting with a macro, if I'm shooting flowers, fungi, herps, any of that stuff, I'm using it off axis, and I've got a soft box. And normally I use a Godox. Actually, I love Godox. Is pretty reasonable. And I'll use an off-camera flash and with a soft box, and sometimes I'll even use multiple flashes if it's camera trapping and stuff like that. But flash is a main light. You don't want to have it on the same axis of the camera and the lens, or it's not going to look good.
Yeah, and how you treat that flash as well. We were talking about soft boxes, and basically you're just diffusing and breaking up that light as it comes out of the flash. So it's almost coming through like sunlight through cloud.
Yes.
So it's a lot
wraps around the subject.
Yeah, it's a lot softer. So it breaks up those light particles, and they spread more evenly over the subject rather than being more direct. So think about the difference between direct sunlight and how harsh that can be, and then light through high cloud and how diffuse and more even that can be. And that's basically what you're talking about, isn't it?
Yeah, and another dichotomy between fill flash and flash as a main light. Flash as a main light, I'll put a softbox on to make it more diffused and envelop the subject. But if flash is a main light, or I'm sorry, flash is fill on top of your camera, Normally, go just the opposite. I put what's called a better beamer, or there's other types of things where you're trying to get the light to hit the subject because it's further away, just to act as the fill for the catch light or a pop of color. So that's completely different. You're actually trying to emphasize the beam more so it hits your subject versus when
Because
you,
you've got, I mean, for people that don't know, if you're using a 600 mil lens, for example,
yeah.
and then you're trying to use a standard speed light on your camera, the power of that is going to struggle. And the more powerful your flash, actually, the I had this issue when I was photographing birds in the garden. I'm going to go off at a tangent here a little bit, but I'm going to try and explain this to people because it's quite a difficult concept to grab. But I was photographing birds in the garden, and my idea was that I wanted to photograph them in the rain, but I wanted to use a backlight. I wanted the background black, and I wanted to illuminate the birds so they were kind of rim lit, and then you get that nice light through the wings as they spread the wings as they're flying to and from feeders, that sort of thing. But I wanted to do it while it was raining, so the flash would then illuminate the raindrops from behind, so it'd almost be like a bird flying through a starry sky. So that's what I wanted. But that meant that I had to get the flash to freeze the motion. Now, normally that's not a problem when you're using those lower powered flash settings, because the flash actually, the duration of the flash is much quicker, much faster than any shutter speed that any camera can offer. But the more powerful you need to make that flash, the longer the duration is. So actually, the more chance you've then got of introducing motion blur for things that are moving really, really quickly. And this is the problem that I had photographing birds during the daylight, because I had to underexpose so much. I had to have the power of the flash almost at its maximum. And then I was getting blur because the duration of the flash was too long. So it was really, really difficult for me to balance those things. So this is the problem that you have with a longer lens. The power of the flash needs to be so great that actually the better thing to do is to introduce a magnification effect on that flash by putting something in front of it. So it's almost like putting a telephoto lens in front of your flash, isn't it?
Yeah.
It's a bit more rudimentary than that, because they're not that expensive to do, but it's almost like a hood over the flash with a sort of plastic lens at the front, which magnifies the effect of that flash, so you actually can use less power in the speed light itself. And actually the recycling time is quicker as well if you're taking multiple images. Yeah.
But if you have one of these faster cameras, you definitely want to slow your shutter down, because if you're shooting 20 frames a second, good luck. Normally, you'll get one of every maybe 10 shots has the flash. I go down to about 5 frames a second.
Yeah, good luck, and wait for your batteries to catch fire, because they will.
And they sell these these supplementary battery packs that look like bazookas, and you can plug in, and those don't even, the one, at least the brand that I have, doesn't. It helps catch up a little bit, but it's not worth it.
No.
So I'll just slow my shutter down to 5 frames a second, or whatever your slower shutter speed is, and it helps. But
we could have a discussion on flash for hours.
Yeah. One thing I love about flash as a main light, I prefer flash as a main light versus just this fill flash for in situations for macro. When it comes to frogs, snakes, and so forth, the colors that come out in using flash and correct, I mean, the colors are so rich. The thing that I feel can either be an aesthetic turn on or an aesthetic turn off for the audience, if it's just me and I'm out in the field and I'm photographing, for instance, frogs. And normally what I'll have a Godox flash off camera with a softbox on, and I have to set it up, and it's difficult. You need a subject that's not going to move around, right? You need a subject that's comfortable with you. So you set up the flash, and I have a little Joby GorillaPod. I'll set it up on, and I'll get the flash set up, and then I'll have the macro lens and my camera in hand, and I'll shoot it. I have a little remote trigger to shoot the flash. Long story short, because you're doing that, you're going to get, unless you have multiple flash setups and you're illuminating everything, you're going to get a black background, or you're going to have significant parts of the frame that are black. You see this in the top 100. There's some amazing images in there of the snail going around the moss, and but you have to be okay and like that aesthetic, that low key look. If you're using flash as a main light with just one flash, you're going to get black backgrounds. You're going to get a lot of dark pieces of the frame. Some people
Because the
don't.
very thing is you're underexposing that image
That's
because
right.
you want the artificial light to light it for you.
Yes,
And that's
exactly.
the reason you get it. Yeah.
Yep. And so a lot of people love that low key look, and some people don't. It just depends on your viewer and your audience. But I think if you're shooting like that with flash as a main light, you need to be comfortable. You need to like that type of aesthetic, because that's what
Yeah.
you're going to get a lot of the time.
And then you can go to the other extreme, can't you? Like the hummingbirds, those sort of studio setups for the hummingbirds, the garden studio, and they got about 5 or 6 different flashes. So it's not only the flash lighting the bird, it's then the flash lighting the background at the same time, which then avoids that very thing that you were talking about. Because
Yeah.
I had an interesting comment from a family member actually, when they looked at some of the images in the bird photographer book, and they said, how can that shutter speed be used and the wings of that hummingbird be sharp? And I said, well, it's not the shutter speed which is actually capturing the image, it's the flash.
Yeah.
It's the duration of the flash which is capturing that image rather than the shutter speed. So it could be half a second if
Yeah.
that exposure of half a second was still enough to not take over from the not allow the ambient light then to expose an image. If it was still underexposed with the ambient light, then the flash is, that sort of brief flash
Mhm.
moment is still going to be the only thing that's recorded. And they said,
I
that's
think
what it is.
and I think, Rob, there's a mathematical way to calculate it. It's like 1/30,000th of a second, or even great, or faster than that. I've read that you can actually calculate how quick it is in terms of
What, the flash duration?
yeah,
Yeah.
in terms of
And
equating
the
it
more
to the shutter
yeah,
speed.
but the more powerful the flash is, the greater the duration of the flash. So the less, so it's almost like, think of it like shutter speed. So the lower the power is on the flash, the faster the shutter speed in
Mhm.
effect.
Yeah,
The more power you've got, the longer that flash has to last. So the more the shutter speed, and that basically is what you're talking about. And
yeah,
that's a lesson I had to learn, through doing stuff that I was doing. And I was thinking, these are blurred. Why are these, come on, then think about it. It's just like, I felt a bit stupid when I actually realized what was going on. You think, of course, but it's like anything. As I said right at the start, flash used to intimidate me. It doesn't anymore. I look at it and I think it's a useful part of my
yeah.
arsenal.
It's
I
another
don't
tool. Yeah,
Yeah, I don't particularly like using it. I'd much rather use natural light, but sometimes it's very, very useful. And the other point I would make about flash is that when you look at a lot of these, photography is expensive, right? We all know this. And one of the suggestions that we had from a listener was, can you do something on, wildlife photography on a budget, which we should do actually, because it is, when you're looking at
yeah,
thousands and thousands of pounds for all the camera equipment, and then you start looking at things like speed lights, and you look at the manufacturer's own brand speed lights, they are generally very, very expensive. What I would say is to people that when you're looking at those items of kit, like the flashes and things, there are alternatives which are much, much cheaper and work with all the major brands.
yeah,
So go down that route, because that's what I do. Because I tell you for why I did this. Is I remember spending 300 odd pounds or whatever on, when I used to shoot Canon, on a Canon Speedlight, which I then dropped in a rock pool and, in the at the coast. And the thing is, if you do that, that's 300 pounds down the tube, because that ain't ever going to work again. So I thought, well, I'm not going to do that every time I want to go out, because these things are going to happen. I'm going to drop things in water. I'm going to sit on things, and, I'm going to break stuff. So I'd much rather spend a lot less on things. And then if I break it, it doesn't really matter. And you can spend a fraction of the cost of the branded items on something which, okay, might not be as good, but it's 9 out of 10,
yeah,
generally speaking. And I've got a whole flash system which works off a little controller for probably the less than the cost of one branded speed light. So if you shop around and you look at it, there are really good value alternatives out there in the market. So just shop around, and that will give you, a system that you will elevate your photography for a lot less than you think.
Yeah.
So it's,
Especially flash cords, they're ridiculously expensive if you buy the camera brands versus, the off-camera stuff. You could save a
oh
lot of money.
yeah, yeah, and you think wireless remotes, right? You think the camera brand stuff is just hideously expensive,
Yeah.
but honestly, it's you can buy things for. I think, if I remember rightly, I've got 3 flashes and a remote trigger, and I think that's less than 1 Nikon Speedlight
Wow.
altogether. Now, it's not going to be as good as the Nikon Speedlight in terms, but you don't in 99 times out of 100, you don't need everything that the branded Speedlight is going to give you.
Yep.
You really don't. And I'd
Definitely.
much rather spend less money. And then if I have to replace a flash, which is £70 as opposed to £350, it hurts a lot less.
Yeah,
So
I like Godox. I mean, I've used them. They're a third party and they're relatively inexpensive compared to, Canon. I'm a Canon shooter compared to some of the Canon stuff. One thing I was just thinking about too, Rob, we were talking about fill flash and we were also talking about flash as a main light. Another good way to blend, I think, ambient and flash is using rear curtain sync, where, you have a shutter speed and using ambient light where you get kind of a slow motion or you get that blur, and then you have of course, the flash goes off at the end of the frame, and you get these awesome images of trailing and blurs. And we've seen those, and well, certainly in bird photography of the year over the years, and some of the stuff in wild art too. You can come up with some pretty cool imagery there.
yeah,
It's
I
another
think
unique way to use that.
that's a really good point actually. With certainly with things in motion,
Yeah,
if you play around with when the flash actually fires, and you can do that in the camera menu, so you can either have it so it fires at the start of the frame, or you can have it firing at the end of the exposure, which is that rear curtain sync that you were talking about.
mhm,
If you start playing around with those, because the other thing is that if you mix in this ambient light and then the flash, so for example, if you've seen those diving kingfisher images, which have these trailing, it almost looks like the kingfisher is blurred, so you've got this sort of trail, and then you've got this sharp kingfisher right at the end. That is done by a mixture of ambient light, or there's an artificial constant light added. So the shutter speed is slower to allow that motion to be captured, but the exposure is set up so the ambient light actually captures that element of it, and then the flash is fired right at the end, which is the frozen bit, which is where you get the frozen image at the end. That's how those images are done. So it's using flash in a creative way like that, and when you start sort of putting these things together, the world is it is limitless as to what
yeah,
you could do.
yeah. And I have to say, strong opinion warning, strong opinion here. But you were talking about hummingbird photography with the multiple flash setups and the I can't even look at those images any. They're so boring to me. I mean, a lot of people still take them, but rear curtain sync would add at least a little bit of interest and maybe some other things. We've seen some cool rim light backlit shots of hummingbirds, which I think are beautiful. But that standard, multiple flash setup with the painted screen behind them, and they put the sugar water in the flat. Oh, it's kind of so cliche. I can't even look at them anymore. They're so boring to me. Sorry.
No comment. How many of those do you think I've seen in my life?
Yeah, it's interesting too because in the Northeast we get basically one species of hummingbird. It's the ruby-throated, and I've had a lot of good in my pollinator garden where they come in. I don't even want to photograph them because I think of those images.
But
Yeah,
there's nothing. What I will say, there's nothing wrong in doing that. I
no,
mean,
no,
if you've never done it before, I've never done it before. It would be
just
fun.
my
For me,
preference,
it would
not
be
his
fun.
opinion. Yeah,
And but what you're trying to say is that you like to see things, you like to see different things you haven't seen before.
yeah,
That's what, and for me as a photographer, that's what gets me going, I have to say. So if you've seen, yes, they're nice, but that's about as far as it goes because you've seen it so many times. It's rather like, I don't know, you see a Nissan Qashqai on the road. It's probably the most common car on the road. So it's a nice car, nothing wrong with it, but it doesn't turn your head, does it? Because you see it
yeah,
every day. But if you see a McLaren driving down the road, you're gonna look, aren't you? Because
yeah.
you don't see them every day. And
And that
and
goes
this is kind of the similar thing.
You're right, and that goes back to an earlier point we were making where if you're shooting in, direct sunlight, more standard conditions, what most people see photography taken in for wildlife, it's up to you got to up your game. It has to be something interesting. If I have direct sunlight and it's in a kind of a situation where most photographers are shooting or what you see most of the time, it's got to be a really cool interaction, a cool predator prey chase, or telling some sort of story. Same with just, kind of your general boring cloudy conditions. It's up to the photographer to raise the game in the image to make that image stand out. If if it's, I guess you could use the car analogy, right? If McLaren or a Lamborghini comes down the road in regular lighting conditions, that picture is probably going to turn a few more heads than a Honda Civic. But you need, if it's a Honda Civic, oh boy, what's a good analogy? I don't know, crashing into
Backlit with
getting
street
run over.
lights and that sort of stuff going
Yeah,
on. Yeah.
yeah, you got to up your game, I think so.
Yeah. Or doing a donut in the, in Times Square or something. Yeah.
Yeah, Fast and the Furious Part 20.
Yeah. Well, yeah. Again, off piste, but still, I think it sort of highlights what we're trying to say. Is that if you so if you're photographing a European robin, for example, and it's a standard shot, front lit shot of a European robin, it might be technically brilliant, it might be perfectly nice, but it's not going to turn your head. Whereas if you underexposed it, flashed it from behind, and you've got this little silhouette of a robin, singing away, whatever, you might go, "Oh, that's a bit different."
Yeah,
That's quite
absolutely.
nice. And that's what you're trying to say is you're introducing the extraordinary elements to the ordinary.
Yeah,
Would that be fair to say?
absolutely. Whereas if you come across something that's extraordinary or if something that's rare or unique or crazy, ordinary conditions would be okay. Like a
I think
pangolin, for instance, right?
that's pretty much nailed it, hasn't it?
Yeah,
Pretty much nailed what we're trying to get across here, in the use of lighting. Use lighting to create the extraordinary. I think
absolutely.
that's pretty good. Let's just, while we're on the point of artificial flash, and I'm conscious of we're yet again you've been yabbering on for quite a while, but I make no
It's
apologies for
easy.
that.
Yeah, yeah.
Let's talk about LED lights, because I actually quite like the use of LED lights. And if you are a little bit intimidated by flash, this is a really good place to start, because they are really inexpensive these days. I mean, you can go on Amazon and buy little LED lights for like no money, and they can be surprisingly powerful. So, and they're sort of thing that aren't heavy. You can carry them around in your pockets, in your camera bag. I found them, and actually most of them as well, you can change the color temperature on as well. So not only have they got a brightness dial where you can dial them up and down a little bit, they've actually got a color temperature dial, which adds an extra little element of spice to things, which can be quite good fun. But particularly if you're photographing things that don't run away, like plants and fungi. I mean, fungi is a really good example of this. There are lots and lots and lots of photographers that use LED lights to light fungi. So those sort of fungi images that appear to be lit from underneath, so almost like sort of lit parasols, that sort of thing. 9 times out of 10 that'll be done by LED lights these days, because they're surprisingly powerful, as people know.
I've seen people use pen lights even, Rob.
Yeah.
They'll put pen lights underneath the fungi.
And there, I mean, let's not get onto painting with light, because that's a whole different subject as well. I don't know how you do that with wildlife photography, but not for things that move around. But anyway, that's another subject. But yeah, you're right, and they will just have so if you've had a longer exposure, for example, let's say you had a 5-second exposure, which isn't unusual if you're photographing fungi in the middle of a forest, and you're using you want to use 50 or 100 ISO, which is great, and you're using a 5-second exposure to expose for the ambient light, you could then take that pen light or that LED light and you could paint. Basically, you could focus on the fungus itself, and then you could paint in, basically point the beam on, like sort of coloring in a coloring in book, if you like, and actually then that extra bit of light will have an effect on your final image, because you're pointing a brighter bit of light during that exposure at the point that you want to emphasize. So if you start playing around with those sorts of things, or you have a constant light source and you put a little LED light on the forest floor, for example, pointing up underneath the underneath the mushroom, and you're photographing it from that angle where you're seeing the gills underneath and then the sky behind it, that sort of thing, they can be really, really effective, those images. So it's really worth playing around with it. I think that's an excellent place to start if you are intimidated by this artificial light, because you can see instantly the effect that that's having on your images in front of your eyes, whereas flash is is a little bit more experimental. You have to go back and have a look at the images you've taken and then adjust the settings and keep playing around with it, whereas with the ambient light you can see instantly what you're getting.
Yeah, definitely more trial and error with a flash than the LED. Like you said, it's right there.
And then we can get into things like reflectors and all that sort of thing. I mean, simple things like carrying around a white piece of card or a bit of tin foil, or those sort of things, just to reflect a bit of light back. And actually, fungus is a great example of that. Bit of white card on the forest floor, reflecting back the light that's coming in through the canopy up underneath, can make a surprising difference. Start playing around with all those sorts of things. This doesn't have to be a very expensive business. I mean, you can do it very, very cheaply, depending on what you photograph.
I've seen fungi shots too, and I've tried this. It's more of a time commitment, but you'll take, if you have, especially if it's a wider scene where you have, a group of, you have a grouping there of fungi, and you have a forested scene behind it. You'll take one exposure can be the general scene, one exposure, for the background, one can be for the fungi, the other you put the pen light under each, and then you merge all these images together. You create a composite, and boy, it can look really pleasing, really pleasing. But it's just an artistic angle for stuff like that. I've seen some of these forested shots with toadstools lit up. I mean, it's stunning. If it's done correctly, it's done.
Yeah.
It takes a lot of time and patience to do it.
I think that's a really good place to end, actually. We sort of have this sort of almost this sort of artistic experimental element just thrown in right at the end. I think the thing is to have a go and just play around with artificial light, and don't be afraid of it, because the results can be, amazing. I think when you look at light as a whole in photography, when we look at natural light, I think the understanding is a bit more instant. When you look at artificial light, there's a bit more of a learning curve with it, but don't be intimidated by it. And the more you experiment with it, boy, some of the results can be completely amazing. I mean, I'm a photographer. I like to work with natural light whenever I can, but I'm not afraid now of introducing those artificial light elements, because I know how powerful they can be. And you can turn a dull day into, a backlighting spectacular with artificial light. It's all in you can control that environment completely. You can almost take a studio outside with you at times.
Yeah.
Have the right conditions. So don't be afraid. So, anyway.
Absolutely.
Josh, thank you so much again.
This is great. This is
been
fun.
A really good discussion. Yeah. I mean, Josh and I really, really enjoyed doing this. And I said we've been getting some really lovely comments from people. So thank you for those. They really are appreciated. We do this because we enjoy it. And if we didn't enjoy it, we wouldn't do it, because it I don't think it would come across. So I hope the enthusiasm and the enjoyment does come across in our discussions. And as I said, if there are any subjects that people want us to cover, then do reach out to us on our social media channels. The links are in the in the show notes, and just let us know what what you'd like to hear about, because we'd be more than happy to sort of pick up the baton and talk about those subjects.
Yeah, and please give us a rating too when you go online on either Apple or Spotify.
Yeah, give us a rating and give us a review, because those things really, really help. The more reviews we get, the more comments we get, the more ratings we get, then the wider the audience that we're going to hit. And if you've been enjoying this, then other people may well enjoy it as well. The other thing I'd like to mention actually is the conservation cause that we're supporting through Wild Art this year, which is a project to purchase a wetland in Australia, which has been brought to our attention by Georgina Statler. You'll know, who's one of the judges in Wild Art. Is a totally amazing wildlife photographer based in Australia. And if you don't know Georgina, then go and look her up on Instagram. Her stuff is awesome. But she is not only is she an amazing photographer, but she is a passionate conservationist. And her project this year is to raise the money to buy an area of wetland in Australia close to her home, which, amongst other things, is a breeding site for the endangered Australasian bittern. So we're helping her with that through Wild Art. So if you've enjoyed the podcast episode, then why not donate just a dollar or a pound or whatever to that conservation cause? And I'll leave a link in the show notes below, where you can go directly to the website that's raising money for that cause, see what it's all about, and go and make a donation. That would be really, really appreciated. I said, we're not asking for anything for doing this. We do it because we love it, but we're also passionate conservationists. And, this year we're trying to help Georgina out, with that cause. So, a pound or a dollar, if you've got something out of this, it would be most appreciated. So I'll leave that link in the show notes. Josh, thanks again. It's been really good fun talking about this subject. I'm not sure. Well, we've got a few ideas next. I'm not sure which one we're going to action next, but we've certainly got plenty of ideas in the pipeline and things that we're working on. So probably another guest, I would say, is going to be the next podcast. And it might be quite soon. So we'll let you know when we put that together. But as I said, Josh, thanks very much for coming on again. And
yes, it's been great.
It's been a really good discussion. So anyway, thanks everybody for listening, and we'll see you again in the next one. You have been listening to the Wildlife Photography Podcast. If you have enjoyed the content, then please help us to spread the word by sharing a link on your social media platforms, giving us a like, and leaving us a comment. See you all again next time.